My name is Arham Sethi, and I'll be presenting my project called the Weed Emergence Risk Mapping, or WERM. Every year, Indian wheat farmers lose 15 to 30% of their potential yield to weeds. And in almost every case, the problem is the same. By the time you see the weeds, your best management window has already been closed. Now, WORM isn't just an academic framework, it answers a question that no existing tool can. Where in my field should I be worried about weeds before they even appear? And that is the operational promise we make with this project. In the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'll walk you through what drives emergence, how we estimate each driver from a photograph, how we fuse them into a single risk score, and most importantly, the validation evidence that this actually works. The problem today with all of the weed emergence mapping, weed detection, as well as weed prediction is that number one, current computer vision for weeds is excellent at detecting them, the weeds, green pixels on brown soil. It's kind of easy to detect that. But detection is reactive. By the time your drone spots a weed, the pre-emergence herbicide window has already been gone. You're now in a more expensive, less efficient post-emergence game. Now, the second problem is the when versus where gap. Emergence models from crop science are phenomenal at telling you when the weeds will germinate. They use thermal time or hydrothermal time and soil temperature models, but they don't exactly tell you where in the field are the weeds going to emerge. So, anyways, if you even get to know that the weeds will emerge in like 7 days or 12 days, you don't know where to focus all of your resources and how much resources to get and how much time and labor to spend on the particular areas of field. It may happen that you are spending a lot of labor and a lot of money on places which do not matter actually. And then there are the single factor failures, the existing models that have tried to predict spatial maps as well as uh, timing of the weed emergence rely on single factors. For example, we have studies that use thermal time and hydrothermal time, as well as studies that use moisture. But the truth is that maybe thermal and hydrothermal time is good for predicting at what time the weeds will emerge, but moisture is not a single determiner of where the weeds will emerge. So the problem is that people or researchers usually rely on one major feature and then call it a day, but that's not the case. And the third thing is that a typical wheat field in Madhya Pradesh might be around 2 to 5 hectares, and walking every meter of that field takes hours. If you know that 80% of the field is low risk and only 20% needs attention, you'd save 4 out of every 5 hours for scouting labor. And that's the practical value proposition we propose. Because, and alongside saving time, you would also save money and your resources. It would be better for farmers as they are letting go of 70 to 80% of their tension as well as their money and time on the weed scouting programs. Then, majorly, right now, it's more relevant because India is facing growing herbicide resistance in major weed species like Phalaris major. Precisely, timely management is no longer optional. It's essential for wheat production in the Indo-Gangetic plains as well. Now, let's move on to the next slide. This is the clear picture of what worm does, what its inputs are right now, and what it outputs. So its inputs are RGB field photos, GPS coordinates, and date, and it has a black box which processes four different features differently and then fuses them in log space, geometric mean, and then it outputs risk score from 0 to 100 per image plus the A to E zone classification. This basically means that each image will be ranked on a risk score. For example, an image which has a high risk score would be ranked, let's say 80 or 90 out of 100, and the lower risk score would obviously be around 10 or 20 or 30. And then based on that, we have created bins. For example, from 0 to 20, we have the A bin, which is the lowest risk. From 20 to 40, we have the B bin, which has a slightly larger risk, and so on till E, which is the highest risk. So the model first takes all of the photos, uses GPS, uses date to find out the time, and find out the time and the temperature, and then gives you the classification. So it gives you a gives you an actionable classification, so to say. The dataset I used was a 333 image dataset across two fields uh, in Indore, Madhya Pradesh. Taken The dataset was recorded on 14th February 2023. The dataset was made by me originally. It wasn't taken from any website or any already existing research paper. And the stage we are at right now is that we have the foolproof methodology and the internal validation pipeline complete. We also have some additional additive versus geometric mean comparative analysis. We have the spatial diagnostics complete. Actually, it's written that it is in progress, but that's not the case. And then again, when we talk about impact, it has the worm has the potential to solve all of the problems I talked about in the previous page. Now let's move on to how all of this actually works. So we use four signals. As I recall, I said in the problem section that one signal always is not that reliable for predicting any type of risk score. So we are using signals like moisture, residue, structure, and thermal. Now, the relevance of moisture is kind of very straightforward. If we have a certain level of moisture in the soil, then the weeds get the opening to emerge. Then residue is kind of something indirect but really important, because weeds need sunlight to grow and sunlight to emerge along with moisture. And when residue is present in the game, then it blocks the sunlight towards the ground, and that is why it suppresses the weeds. So we're not multiplying residue directly. As you can see in the formula below, we are multiplying 1 minus residue, or the inverse or the inverse effect of the residue, and in the geometric mean space. Then we are using the structure. Obviously, if the weeds will grow only if they get proper air ventilation, as well as gases necessary for respiration and growth alongside moisture and sunlight. So if the field is heavily tilled, then it would be most likely that the weeds will emerge in that particular area. And then thermal is always directly related, like moisture. If there is a certain level of temperature that weeds require to grow, for example, in Indore we have Phalaris major, as well as some other weed types like rabi weeds, at least two or three rabi weeds, and their threshold growth temperature is about 2 or 3 degrees. So the more the temperature is, the more growing degree days they technically get to grow out and emerge on particular seasons and particular days and particular coordinates of the field. Then let's go about the moisture component exactly. How we predict the moisture component is that we train the ResNet 18 backbone with a sigmoid regression head, and the training was actually a transferred learning or transfer training from dry, moderate, and wet classifier to a fine-tuned regression. Because what we did before was we were thinking about having the moisture component as a simple classification model, but then we figured out that if we have to multiply it in the log space, then we would need a continuous value. So we first had a data set which was a classification data set, but then we transferred the learning from the classification data set into a data set from INSA, which was a specific moisture labeled INSA regression data set, which was kind of less in size. It was approximately 150 to 160 images, but that wasn't a problem because the learning had already transferred from the classification model. The loss we used was MSE regression loss, and the final train MSE was 0.004305. As I've said, the data source was INSA soil moisture regression dataset, and we also conducted an expert validation ordinal agreement analysis, in which I sat with two farmers which had a veteran experience of around 20 to 30 years. They tried to classify the level of moisture in soil from in three classes: low, medium, and high, just by seeing the soil. And the range of the moisture predictions was equally divided into three parts. The lower part was expected to correspond with the farmer's prediction of the particular soil as a low moisture label, and so on was the medium and high classification bins. They were also required to correlate with numbers that lied in their specific range. So the result of this expert validation was 97.8% ordinal agreement between the low, medium, and high classes, between the ordinal judgment of the farmer and its correlation with the CNN outputs. Then another thing was that we ranked 30 sample soils, and these were like given ranks from 1 to 30, the 30 soil moisture samples, and they were hand ranked. Basically, the farmers and me, we would touch the soil, and then we would rank its wetness as a score. And in science as well as research, it is kind of a very good measure of ranking the level of soil moisture, because people are usually able to accurately predict which soil is relatively better than the other by touch. So it was research backed. And then we move on to the residue component. Again, we had the ResNet 18 regression head, and but this time we didn't do any transfer learning. The data source was USGS ground cover style imagery dataset, and the expert validation was the similar procedure, which ended up to be 93.7%. We also did the photogrid validation. We divided the photo into 10 into 10 grids for 30 to 40 images, and then manually counted the percentage for residue, and so that we have some ground truth labels as well. So this was the regression head for the residue. Obviously, we did not use the log cost, we did not use the MAE or the MAC loss for this one, because when it comes to residue, it is highly diversified from image to image. So we use the log cost loss for robust regression, and the log cost loss would basically act for MSE when the differences are minute, and MAE when the differences are kind of varied and uh, large. Then we move on to the structure or the tillage component. For the tillage component, we did not use any convolutional neural network. We used GLCM contrast or the 32 gray levels analysis, and it was chosen after a particular process. So what we did was we created two synthetic data sets which had 20 images each. One had the highest tillage, one had the highest structural disturbance, and the other data set of 20 images had the lowest structural disturbance of them all. And we were testing models, basically Laplacian variance, some CNNs, as well as GLCM contrast, and we were testing it on based of which model or which process would give the strongest separation in the exploratory tests. So when we ran out the experiments, we found out that GLCM contrast was the process that gave the strongest separation between the two sets. It gave a separation of about 0.5 or 0.6 between them, which was considered as pretty high when we are talking about real-time judgment as well. Then we did some basic percentile normalization on every GLCM contrast score that appeared from it. And there is one more, a very let's say a new and an innovative thing we tried in the world of machine learning here. We did a residue damped correction. So this actually happened when we ran the full model, and we were getting some false predictions for structural disturbance. It is because the GLCM contrast in the end then judges the sides and the sharp edges in the images. It does not technically directly judge any structural disturbance. So if the images had a lot of residue, then the residue edges were giving an output of more GLCM contrast, which was kind of problematic. because even in the images which did not have a lot of structural disturbance, if they had a lot of residue, then the structure and tillage component also blew up very quickly. So what we did was a residue damped correction. We calculated the effective tillage, which was equal to the tillage of to the normal tillage prediction multiplied by 1 minus r, which is the residue component, to the power of alpha. Now alpha was basically the power up constant, the powering constant for residue, and we did some internal validation tests, and we find out that the value of alpha inversely correlates with the effective tillage, and in the end that particularly means that effective tillage is inversely proportional to residue, which is what we wanted. And this similar kind of expert validation or ordinal agreement was conducted, and the result was a 96.5% match. On the side we have figures of contribution in the log space, and it shows that the structure component had the largest contribution in log space when it came to predict the risk maps, as well as we calculated some correlation tables and graphs for factor dependence and rank stability. So when we modulated the value of alpha from 0 to 2, then we got a downward slope, particularly highlighting the negative and inverse relationship between effective tillage and residue. Then we also tested the rank stability, which came out to be pretty even. After that, we finally move on to the thermal component. In the thermal component, we use the NASA Power API. The API maps the temperature for each and every coordinate in the world. And it's a very reliable practice to fetch temperature from this API and use this in prediction models. We calculated the growing degree days. Basically, we converted the temperature into growing degree days for specific weeds, as well as a generalized standard for over 7 days. These growing degree days are very simply the number of the easiness of the weeds to emerge based on what temperature is prevailing currently. And we use the default base temperature as 10 degrees Celsius. Then in this there was no data set specifically, because we were having the NASA Power API. But an interesting thing here is that its variance contribution, or the fusion contribution of this thermal component in the risk finalization and risk prediction was 0%. But we have a strong reason behind it, because the data set was collected in just 1 day. There was no specific variance in the thermal temperature there. The temperature was constant, and that is why the variance contribution is 0%. But we can say, if the data set had been collected over a long period of time, then we would obviously see some variance contribution by thermal component as well. Now let's move on to the next slide. We have the fusion engine. This is basically the geometric mean method in the log space fusion. We take the moisture prediction, we take its power to 0.3. We take the residue, and we take its power to 0.2. We take the structure, we take its power to 0.3. And we take the growing degree days, or the temperature component, thermal component, and take its power to 0.2. These powers are basically weights that add up to 1. And we used when we convert that, when we take the log of risk, then it becomes additive. But when we don't take the log of risk, or we don't take the logarithm of this whole expression, then it is multiplicative. We choose this over the added general weighted additive combination, because biology works differently. If a certain level of moisture isn't present in the soil, then the weeds won't emerge, despite the field being structurally disturbed, or despite the field having been fully free of any residue, or the temperature being perfect. This suggests that all of the components should be multiplied instead of added, so that the model can effectively suppress the predictions and the risk scores, when the basic contribution of the factors is not being achieved. And so yeah, this was majorly it about the fusion engine. Let's move on to the next slide. We had the geometric versus additive fusion comparison, because when we are writing any paper, then obviously they require us to contradict against the standard procedure so that we can justify why we used a particular procedure in our methodology. So we conducted a thorough analysis and we found out that the geometric mean correctly suppresses all of the images that need to be suppressed, as seen in this regression diagram shown here, where the geometric risk score, the red dots are the geometric predictions and the blue dots are the additive ones. The additives are kind of scattered and above the baseline, whereas most of the geometric predictions are below the baseline. And we also calculated some basic statistics so that we could display it in the paper. For example, the Spearman correlation, the Kendall, and top 20 Jacquard and top 10 Jacquard. The results were all above 0.839, which is kind of a very reliable outcome for us. Now let's move on. Again, this is the multiplicative suppression I was talking about when we choose the log space combination or the geometric mean instead of the uh, standard weighted additive combination. Then we have the ablation and robustness section. We conducted a series of internal validation tests. We had the leave one factor out rank stability. We had the rank stability for noise. And it basically showed that even if we add some noise, the colors and jitters, and change some lighting, then the rank stability is pretty even because it's right around 1. And when we add some 5 or 10%, then it just goes around zero point 0.9, 0.95, which is still reliable than all of the other models in the market. Then we have the weight sweep robustness. We basically try a lot of different combinations of weights and see how it affects the predictions of the model. We also use different kinds of scaling methods and compared all of the scaling methods. In the end, we use the median absolute deviation and the Tannet scaling from 0 to 100, which worked the best for us. Now we have the weight ensemble uncertainty. We basically modeled around 500 random weight configurations, like we saw the power 0 0.2, 0 0.2, 0 0.3, and 0 0.3. We made some 500 random weight configurations. For example, we gave one model, let's say 0 0.01, and one model 0 0.9 something. And all of these we tried all of these weight configurations, and we still had the mean variance around mean correlation between each of the following predictions with the random weights being 0.945, which is a quite high score. Majorly, despite of all of the random weights, the model still holds its truth when it comes to prediction of weeds and all. And even the top 20 Jacquard was 80.4%, which is basically that the top 20% risk images, out of the top 20% risk images, 80% of the high risk images stayed in the high risk bracket of the top 20%, which is an even more reliable risk considering considering the fact that we had 500 absolutely random weight configurations instead of the particularly fine-tuned weights. And this translates to 42 images being completely robust to all of the weight noise. But we did have around 26 images which had high uncertainty, which is normal for any domestically constructed data set. Then we had expert agreement and risk distribution. These are again all of the internal validation tasks we conducted. Baseline risk composition, we had all among the 333 images. This is the graph showing how the model predicted the images from A to E. For example, the A class had 119 images, B class had 37, C had 24, and so on, as visible here. This is the factor contribution in log space. I have already told you all about it. The contribution of moisture as well as GDD is so low because their variance in that particular single day data set wasn't that high as of now. Now, for the summary of the expert ordinal agreement, it was 97.8% for the moisture. For residue, it was 93.7 percentage, and for texture, it was 96.5%. We also conducted the species specific thermal sensitivity analysis. We found out that the basic temperature we took, that was 10 degrees, was kind of very generalized, and it when we analyzed the species specific thermal sensitivity, we found out that the default temperature underestimates the thermal accumulation by over 2 to 2.5 times for all of the three rabi weeds we analyzed, which is basically the Phalaris minor, the C album, and the M indica, which have their local names as shown here. Their temperature was around 1, 3, and 0 degrees Celsius. So their GDD and risk would be technically multiplied by 1.17 or 1.16. It would be higher by 16 or 17%, but it wasn't higher because we took the default temperature to be quite high. So after the species specific thermal sensitivity, we modified the model to input the crop type as well as the GPS and the RGB. If we get the crop type, then we would be able to predict which type of species could emerge there, and then we could take the mean of the temperatures that each of those likely to emerge weed species would have, and then we would take that particular base temperature for calculating the growing degree days, to get a more reliable outcome in the end. These graphs show how we underpredicted the GDD for all of these three species and how we corrected it in the end. Now let's move on to the ground truth verification. I already talked about the photogrid residue validation as well as the touch ranked moisture validation. The touch ranked moisture validation ranks had a Spearman correlation with the CNN predicted moisture relative moisture ranks of the images of the 30 images to be 0.879, which is a quite reliable score when we're talking about real time. Moisture ordinal and residue ordinal and texture ordinal was already displayed, as well as the photogrid residue validation was conducted. So we know that the CNN predictions that our model is making are kind of grounded and usable for everyday purposes as well as commercial purposes. Now let's move on to the final part of the research, which is the spatial diagnostics, which includes the semi-variograms and the Morin-Zaya analysis. In this, basically, we had this part of the research because Ploton et al., the researcher Ploton et al., severely criticized such type of spatial awareness researches, showing that they give out random signals and random noises and never base it on and never verify it on spatial distribution. So the main objective of this diagnostic was so that we can actually say it reliably that our model predicts some particular ranges where the moisture is high and some particular ranges where the moisture is low. So what we did was, this was another field visit and a field research project. We created a geotag data set. Basically, I divided a field into a grid which had 10 columns, 7 columns, and in each column we had 10 rows, or we can say 10 rows and 7 columns, or 7 rows and 10 columns. And at each point in the grid, we took one photo. After removing the noise, we had a total of 61 geotagged photos, and we added some spherical model fits to all of the 4 variables, and we found out all of the ranges. The ranges were as displayed here, and 38.8 for moisture range, 45.7 for residue range, 45.7 for texture range, and the risk range was 35.2 meters. This was the result of all of the semi-variograms, as the semi-variograms are displayed here. Uh, Now we move on to the spatial clustering block. and this had the Moran's eye analysis. The spatial cluster block was basically where similar kind of predictions happened in the model. For example, if the farmer has to focus his particular efforts, labor, and time and resources on a particular part of field, then which part of the field would it be scientifically? This was that spatial clustering and analysis. All of the Moran's eye analysis statistics are displayed here. Then this is the final risk heat map we created of the field. This is the field where I took all of the images. Since there is less accuracy in GPS as of now in that particular area, therefore it didn't come out to be a proper rectangle, but it did show the parts of field which had high risk, which is the dark red section here, the dark red section here, and some dark and some red sections here which have moderate risk. So if the farmers deploy this model, then they would get this risk heat map for themselves, and they would obviously get a better translation of what to do with this risk heat map. So they would, for this case, they would be able to reduce around 50 to 60% of their labor, efforts, time, and resources, and focus only on the red areas of the field, which would help them mitigate all of the risks. This is the final risk heat map. The thing is that this is our novelty as well, because no model or no research currently in the world predicts a spatial risk heat map based on four features analysis of weed emergence before weeds actually emerge. So this was a big thing, and it proved its novelty when it generated this risk heat map as well. So on the validation roadmap, we have completed all of the things listed here, all of the internal validation tests, the ground truth verification tests, the specific thermal sensitivity tests, the ordinal agreement tests, as well as the whole 11 page, the 9-10 page latex paper with all of the figures in the tables, as well as the spatial diagnostics. Now, the only things remaining are actually, this thing was also completed. The paper placeholders were also finished, and we had to do some final manuscript polish. I got the email from my mentor, Mr. Rajesh Khanna Putkari, and he said that he reviewed the paper and it's fine for publication as of now. Then the only things remaining after that are submitting it to conferences and journals. And now the future plans and for the future plans and positioning, we plan on doing some seasonal emergence validation. Basically, we would go to a field and we would take all of the photos, we would pass it through our model, and then after 1 month or 2 months, we would come back and count the weeds in specific areas of the field, so that we can say that the risk actually is meaningful in the real world. We would do crop aware species parametrization, which I said we took the decision after doing the species specific thermal sensitivity analysis. And we would do a multi-field, multi-date expansion of this two field and spread across 2 months data set. As well as we would do some drone integration. This is something interesting we planned. We would upload this model on a drone, and then the drone would itself be capable of predicting spatial maps and timely prediction of weeds, so that the farmers don't have to go around and click photos in the whole field. We would also upload the decision support integration. Basically, it would have a map that would tell the farmers exactly what to do with the predictions of the model, so that it is the most useful for them. Now, then again, the novelty and the contribution is that it's the first pre-emergent spatial risk map from RGB and GDD. It is multiplicative fusion with biological justification. It has the residue damped texture correction, which no current texture prediction model does in the world. It has the species-aware thermal parametrization, as well as a comprehensive structural validation without emergence data. Here are some publication targets, and yeah, that's it. Thank you.